Well, I am pleased to welcome Yasmine El Rashidi to Politics and Prose this evening to discuss her new book, Chronicle of Last Summer, which recounts a young Egyptian woman's personal and political coming of age, the turmoil of a Mubarak-led and then overthrown Egypt. It's a brilliant debut novel, and as a review from the Huffington Post aptly notes, Al Rashidi paints a landscape of life growing up in Cairo that feels so vivid and all consuming that the reader could simply melt into the narrator and be present. Any American reader who's felt that news stories, like those about Egypt's 2011 revolution and what's followed, seem distant and baffling will finish Chronicle of the Last Summer with a new depth of empathy and understanding. Yasmin is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and editor of Bidoun, the Middle East Arts and Culture Quarterly. She currently resides in Cairo and is working on translating the works of Egyptian novelist Kahirala. I'm sorry about that, Ali. Please join me in welcoming Yasmine El Rashidi to Politics and Prose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Um, I was going to start by reading 3 small sections from the book, and then I think really I'm most interested, I think, in having a conversation with all of you. I arrived from Cairo not very long ago, so I'm a bit jet-lagged. And I did an event yesterday, and as a few friends said, you were very, very slow. So I feel the same. I feel a bit better today, but I still think I'm a bit slow. So the book is it's told in 3 parts across 3 summers: the summer of 1984, the summer of 1998, and the summer of 2014. And it's the narrator is a young girl who you meet in 1984 as a 6-year-old, and then you meet her again in 1998, and she's a college student, and then in 2014 as an adult. So I'm going to read small parts from across the book. This is from 1984. Once we had a new cleaning lady who stole from Mama. She never came back, but the police caught her. Mama and Baba took me with them to the prison to see her. They wanted to make sure she was the right thief. We went in Baba's car, over the bridge, past buildings, until we were far, where the desert was. They took us inside. We went up dirty stairs. It was dark and smelled of pee. She was in a small room behind bars like a cage. There was a wooden stool like Abdu used to have, and a dirty red towel hung from the wall. When she saw Mama, she started crying and saying, "Sorry, sorry, I am sorry." The policeman shouted to her, "Shut up." He used the bad word. She kept crying, "Sorry." Mama turned her face away and took my hand. She squeezed it and pulled me. I didn't know if she had accepted her sorry. I wanted to ask, but my lips were sealed. The prison was frightening. People were screaming and shouting from places I couldn't see. One man looked at us from behind bars and roared like a lion. His hands were black. We went down and waited for Baba in the car. Later I heard Baba say that they had gone to her house in the night and taken her away. They made a racket so that everyone in the neighborhood could hear. They took her away in front of her children. What would they do with her? He didn't answer. Every time I see a policeman going into a building, I think maybe they will take someone away. In class, I write a story called The Disappearing People. I write about going to the prison. I write about the people they take away. It happens only at night. My teacher gives me 0 out of 10 and says I shouldn't be writing such things at my age. At home, I cry to Mama and show her the story. She reads it and sits without saying a word on my bed. I think she is angry. It scares me when Mama is angry. Sometimes she shouts when she is angry, and sometimes she is just quiet. The quiet angry is much worse. Reading makes me very nervous, so I feel my voice shaking. And then this is a part from the summer of 1998. And the character here is Dido, who is the girl's cousin, older cousin. Dido urges me to involve myself in politics, to make documentary films about dissidents rather than the cinematic ambitions of fictional cinema verite I have. It's about time, he says. It's important to connect with my anger. He says I can make art through activism and documentary, a different art, more potent. But that's reality, not art. But he is adamant and becomes more insistent, surprises me on campus between classes, giving me books inscribed and signed, please, love. He also passes by the house on odd Saturdays, bringing with him 10 piastres worth of dried sunflower seeds, sitting beside me on a step in the garden, blowing perfect smoke rings from rolled cigarettes. I listen as he goes on about reform, and I start methodically recording our time together, flipping my notebook back and around and making that side for him. I start each entry with his mood, writing down everything I remember of our afternoons. He's the only person I know who speaks of changing the country. Love and revolution are one, he says. They come together. In the past 2 years, there have been gatherings of people in the square with signs chanting for Palestine. Nobody ever mentions Egypt. People generally don't talk about the status quo, even though everyone yearns for change. I do. It seems that politics is at the foreground and background of everything, yet not something that can be impacted in any way. Mama wishes things were different, though she never says so in direct ways. But I can tell. Even when she smiles or laughs, I can see her sadness is much greater, a melancholy so steeped in who she is. I'm not sure anyone I know is deeply angry, even as they are unfulfilled, restless, somewhat resigned. Uncle complains about things, laments, talks about the incompetency of government, but not with the vehemence of anger that Dido suggests. I don't think I am angry at all, as much as Dido insists we all are. He says we just don't know how to express it, that we weren't taught to be in touch with ourselves. The way we live our lives is no better than death. And this is, I'm moving to the summer of 2014. I think. Sorry, I'm having a second thought about this. No, I'm still in the summer of 1998. Apologies. It's very short. I go into my bedroom and sit at my desk. It's facing the big window overlooking the Nile. I can't see the Nile. I can't see anything except the overgrown mango trees. We keep talking about pruning them. The gardener says nobody in the country knows how to prune. He doesn't know what we mean. He tells us he can cut them down if that's what we want. Mama gets upset when he says this. She slams the window, shakes her head. We let the trees grow. They are higher than the house. But there aren't any mangoes. There haven't been mangoes in 5, 6, maybe 7 years. Every summer I wait to see. Maybe this year they will fruit again. And then they don't. I ask the gardener and he says the soil is bad. How does the soil become bad? He shrugs his shoulders. It's just the way it is. Something from Allah. I think of maybe starting my film with the mango trees. I flip through my script and wonder about the soil. And then I'm just going to read a short, excerpt from the third part, which is the summer of 2014. Uncle turned to me and asked what I thought. All through the summer he had been saying we were on the brink. He told me I had to learn to feel the air change. It was all in the sounds, the way the particles moved, echoed. The sounds of the city had shifted. We had sat on the balcony on consecutive Sundays over the entire summer and listened. He pointed to the reverberations of car horns, how the honking had both quieted and intensified, taken on a different impatience. We listened to the voices that echoed in from the streets and across the river. The constant chatter had given way to more abrupt bursts of expression. Something was pacified, followed by discharge. We could make out none of it, but the very tenor had shifted. We also listened for when the sound of the city suddenly stopped. ACs and the drone of business and machines and generators would roar and then collapse. For a moment there would be quiet. Then the cars and the honking and a rumble would begin. It was a sign of excess, a city overcapacity. We were breaking down. It was like a building, Uncle said, filled beyond measurable proportions, badly wired with extensions, borrowed power, borrowed pipes. He would look at me and shake his head, say nothing, but I knew what he was thinking. He had said it many times before over the years. This was what my generation was inheriting. It was up to us to mitigate the losses, the mistakes. Uncle tried to hold on to as many of the better memories as he could. Many with Granny and Mama on this same balcony, eating mangoes, watermelon, white cheese, watching the Nile and looking out onto the expanse of green fields. It reached the horizon and seemed to extend further into the unknown. All we could see now beyond the sliver of Nile and the bushes of the garden were miles of a sepia city, and past that, in a horizon marked by a chalk line of rust red, the informal settlements. They made me think back to when Baba used to take me with him to the factory when I was a child. Back then the roads in the center of town were paved, but once you got to the outskirts of the city, much of it was dirt track. You knew you had come to the city's end. It was like reaching the edge of the earth, where one line and color and atmosphere ended, and a plunge into something less certain began. Baba would slow as he maneuvered the car down from the tarmac onto the rougher pebble tracks. The sprawling tapestry of sepia and unfinished red brick blocks that now extends for miles was then just desert, or crop. The colors around us changed. As I looked out from the balcony, I remembered all this. Rows and rows of red brick and concrete buildings, unfinished, not connected in any way to the infrastructure of the built city. It was there, Dido had said, that the fight would erupt. I think that's enough. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm happy to kind of talk about the process of how the book came to me, or if you prefer that like someone wants to start with a question. I mean, I'd like to make this work for everyone. Okay. So, I had been trying to write a book on. I was born and raised in Egypt, in Cairo. I've lived there my whole life. I started writing in school. My mother teaches English literature, and it was something that I was drawn to as a result. And even though I'm from Cairo, it's so much a part of who I am. It's such a vast, and I know I see people in the audience who know Cairo very well. It's such a vast, sprawling city, and it's can be quite overwhelming. And I think you're either so caught up in the struggle of everyday survival, or you struggle to find like a small space and a breathing space for yourself in the city. And I have an older brother who works on the city. He works in conservation, and he's an architectural historian, and somehow he's managed the city that way. And for me, I could never really find the space for myself. And writing was my way of trying to deal with that, and deal with how fraught everything felt, this love-hate relationship with place. And I had been trying to write, this was before the revolution, a non-fiction book that grappled with that and tried to make sense of it for me, and tried to make sense of the discomfort I felt in this place that was home. I knew no other place. And it was this process of writing kind of into failure. Every time I tried to write into something, I found myself in a vacuum. And it was partly when I tried to draw on my memory and tap into sort of spaces where I knew there should be a memory. I found that there was nothing there. When I tried to draw on borrowed stories or the stories of people around me in my life, I came up against the obstacles of sort of what our culture is, which is it's built around privacy and respect, that there's a lot that you can't talk about, shouldn't talk about. And then I kept coming up against multiple truths, these very, very different versions of our history, both personal histories, but also the political history of the country, and how so much seems to be overwritten and then rewritten conveniently at different moments in time. And so I was really struggling with this book, and then the revolution happened, and I got, like everyone, was completely swallowed in it, in the everyday, and I was writing these long pieces for the New York Review of Books throughout 2011, throughout that period. And as I was writing and as I was living this, I realized, it sort of hit me what I had been trying to do with this nonfiction book, which was that I wanted to understand, what I was most interested in was our silence, how we came to be silent. And that, if one considers that 2011 was this kind of this eruption of this chorus of voices who were expressing a discontent with things that, it wasn't new. It was a condition we'd been living in for decades. But it was only at that moment that suddenly we started to voice it. And I realized that it was the silence that preoccupied me, because it was a silence that was political, certainly, until that moment. But it was also, it was a very personal silence, in that you're raised to act a certain way, you have to behave a certain way. There are parts of you that, if they don't quite conform with what is expected of an Egyptian girl or boy, you have to swallow them. And in reflecting on myself and looking at the people around me, I realized that we had been swallowing ourselves in many ways for decades. And as I thought about this, and I grappled with how one could understand that silence, and I realized that it can really only be understood in the everyday. I think that there's often pressure to write sweeping, definitive, very large books about a place and a culture, and that didn't seem to me to be the way to get at the truth of where I'm from, and the truest truth I feel of how we come to be who we are starts when we're very, very young, and it starts at home and with the people around us, the people that we interact with the most. And it's really in these tiny, tiny learned behaviors that you either are told or you pick up, or when you start to voice something, the parent who tells you, not to say that, or even with a gesture, you learn that you have to be silent. And so this character, came to me as I was thinking about the everyday and what the everyday means. And I was interested in, in how you learn behaviors, but also how you were taught about your history and what you carry forward. And in a country like ours, I mean, those of you here who know Egypt and the Middle East know this, is that like history is really according to where you are in society, you will learn a different history. And so I was interested in that, and how you carry, like, what you take with you, and how that then informs who you are in the world. And so I wanted, I wanted to understand that silence, but I also wanted to see how that silence played out over years and decades into a life and into who a person becomes. And that person being someone who doesn't speak up and then one day speaks up. Is that behavior, does it become sort of innate to who you are, and is it behavior that can be undone? We had this revolution, everyone took to the streets, everyone was vocal, and then we seemed to fall back over time into a silence. And that's something I think about a lot, and I question in myself also, is that my stamina lasted so long, and I too in ways have fallen back into that space of silence. And it's something that, I mean, it preoccupies me, and it's something that it really, I think that the book is so much really about that. That's very broad and brief, but I'm happy to sort of take questions or have a conversation. Yeah,
I'm supposed to use the mic, right?
yeah.
Even though I'm loud. Anyway, Yasmine, thank you. My name is Hiba, and what you said was perfect. I'm a little older, so my silence was around 1967, where my mother actually said that we were from Spain and not from Egypt.
Wow.
So she wouldn't talk about 1967, yeah. So anyway, and
Were
I
you
wasn't,
here?
no, we were in London actually.
Wow.
And I wasn't allowed to talk about it. And I wasn't allowed to ask her why she said we were from Spain. So I understand perfectly the silence.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, 67 was really bad.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question that I hope it's not challenging, but when you say that we're raised a certain way, we conform a certain way, absolutely. And regarding the uprising, which actually I call an uprising instead of really a revolution. I wish it was a revolution.
No, I usually use uprising, but I'm nervous, so I'm using
It's okay. It's okay. Anyway, ahlan wa sahlan. Anyway, Biki. So welcome to Washington. But do you think it's a class issue? Because I worked with workers over the last 20 years, and it was different. Workers in Egypt. So could you maybe ponder that, or kind of talk about this in the sense of, was it a class? If you were upper class or upper middle class, there was this sort of taught silence and behavior and so on, where if you're talking to the lower classes and the working class particularly, they were quite vocal. And they had strikes, they had sort of over quite a period of time, actually starting in the 80s. So I just wondering a little bit if it's sort of and class is very serious in Egypt. Which class you belong to. Anyway, sorry for the
That is
long.
I mean, what you said about 67 is so fascinating. I want us to that is a challenging question, and I will answer as best I can, but there are also two people I see in the audience who might be able to chime in. I mean, I think one of the things that was overlooked with the uprising in a lot of the press, the Western press, was that the labor movement was at the core of it. It happened very quickly how January 25th, 2011 suddenly became what it did. And, I feel that the Western press, and I say this because we all read it, and that's, I think, how the people experienced it from here. They had to very, very quickly find a narrative. They had to find a way of telling the story. And most foreign correspondents in Egypt don't know Arabic. And they needed a way of accessing that story they were going to tell. And it so conveniently became the Facebook and Twitter revolution, which, that's a revolution of the privileged. And it wasn't them, they became the face of it. But at the core, you're absolutely right. Their labor movements, they had been striking and protesting for years, and they were, in a way, I think, the backbone of this. So in a sense, absolutely, it's a class thing in that at the core also of the uprising was the demands for a better life. Bread, freedom, dignity, social justice. The flip side of that is that right now there's a lot of criticism of where Egypt is and of the current president and of the current government. But when you speak to people on the streets, they're making this choice. And the choice, they experience the past 5 years have been so turbulent. And 2011, being out in the square, you'd speak to people, and a lot of these, 60% of our population is under the age of 25. So when you were in that square and on the streets, they were mostly young people. And most of them, when you'd speak to them, they'd say, I want to be able to get married and have my own apartment and have a child. And I can't get married and I can't do any of that because I don't earn enough. Somewhere in our magical thinking, and I had that magical thinking too, there was this idea that we made a revolution, which at the time we thought it was, and our lives are going to become better. And that obviously didn't happen, That's just, it's revolution or uprising is the beginning of change. And because of how turbulent it was and all these cycles that we went through, now when you speak to people, even though we are living under, really it's a fascist, it's fascist rule. I feel it's in ways worse than it's ever been, but people still say that relatively we're better off than we were before. Because during the past few years, before the army took over again, there wasn't a sense of, there was a bit of a sense of disarray and disorder and chaos in the streets. People didn't feel very safe or secure. The informal economy in Egypt is huge. So a lot of people, and I don't want to, I feel at one point it was 40%, I don't know what it is now, were earning their wages on a day-to-day basis based on that informal economy. And during those few years, they no longer knew if they'd earn the £10 or the £50 with which they'd buy the food to take home that day to feed their families. And now they know that there's some semblance of order, and they know that they can go to that street corner and set up their basket with vegetables, and the regulars will come and buy, and so they'll be able to take home the £20 to feed their families. And so, in ways it's absolutely, it is about privilege and lack of privilege. I don't know if that answers your question. And what it will take, I think, for further change is to reach the breaking point with the economy, which we're sort of edging in that direction. Inflation is high. Prices are so high. You go into the supermarket, it's shocking. It's not sustainable. Sir?
Why don't you think the revolution took? It was such an exciting time, and why did the Brotherhood win, and then why did it revert back to military rule?
The Brotherhood were very organized. They've been organizing. They had been organizing for decades, and where they weren't given a space in the political system and openly in society, they organized their own system underground, and they'd been working systematically for years. Whereas everyone else, I'll never forget attending these meetings of political parties during 2011, after those 18 days, and people arguing about the logo, and parties breaking up over what logo they would have, and it's so interesting how cyclical history is, in that Nasser, he wrote this tiny book, I forget what it's called now, but it was this tiny thing, and he writes about how, and of course it was, different, but there was a similar echo. He wrote about how after 52, it was all about I. Everyone was talking about I, and everyone had their own idea and their own solution, and there was this inability to come together and make compromises and work together. And he writes about the ego. And I feel that we experience a similar thing. And the Brotherhood, for the period of time until they came into power, we're still working with that ego that had been set aside because they were persecuted, essentially. And then they came to power and tried to monopolize everything, and I forgot the second half.
Why did it end up reverting to military rule?
Because I think they made, it was several things. They made so many promises, and they offered this hope to people. They had always offered services to the community where the government had failed.
With the Brotherhood?
The Brotherhood. Like in poor communities, you'd go and they'd have these kiosks where they sold fruits and vegetables at subsidized prices, or you'd go and you'd see them give bags of fruits and vegetables to the poor who would come. They'd offer, lessons to students. The educational system is very, very poor, and you have to take extra lessons. They had a system worked out that offered that. They offered school supplies at subsidized prices. So they were offering all these services, and somewhere in coming to power and wanting more and more and more power, that sort of fell wayside, and they became so preoccupied with securing more, there was this attempt when they were rewriting the constitution. They did everything to block a sort of a plurality of voices in that process. They issued a constitutional declaration which basically undermined everyone and everything, including the judiciary. So very, very quickly, they reverted to a dictatorship that was worse than, I think, anything we had seen before. Now it's even worse, but at the time it seemed to be the worst.
Thank you.
I don't know. I hope that answers you. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmine. My name's Karim. I'm Egyptian and American. And your discussion of, let me pull this up, I'm a bit tall here. I'll do this. Okay. That's okay, it's okay. I'll be quick. I'll be quick. A simple question. No, I'm sorry. So to be quick, the point of silence and breaking the silence resonated with what I observed when the first time I went back to Egypt after 2011. And I saw that now people were having all kinds of people having very heated debates, passionate views as to what should happen now, what's going to happen now. There was real political discourse among the population, and I hadn't seen that before. That was kind of a new thing to me, and I was very excited about that, but it was also something that I felt to be new. And so because of the strong disagreements and the strong passions, it was almost like people were, even more feeling more tense about that, or all of a sudden. And then I was, I'm like, this is a new function of democracy. This is a new feature, but it's still new. And so people were kind of still trying to make sense or get used to being noisy, despite the irony that Cairo is a very noisy place anyway, but, in terms of political discourse. And so then my question on that is with this book and addressing this and among others theme, is it also available in Arabic? And if not, if it were to be available in Arabic, would it be any different? And so then also tied to that was, did you have, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, when you were writing it, some kind of an audience in mind or a target group to send the message to? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I mean, your observation about 2011 is absolutely correct. And Elliot Kola, who's some of you will know, who's a writer, a translator, critic, and has lived in Cairo for many years. We were just speaking about this, how it was suddenly this opening, whereas everything had been very sort of contained and people were very careful before. 2011 for all of us, it was, and we could speak, so we all wanted to speak, which sadly is not the case anymore. We're back to the silence. When I was, it should be, we're going to translate it into Arabic and it will be published by Shurut, but that at the pace of things, Egyptian pace of things, it might take years. I didn't have an audience in mind, and that there were certain, I didn't even know if I'd be able to publish what I was writing. It's there are often sort of ideas of the kind of book certain people should write, and I was viewed in a certain way as an Egyptian who writes nonfiction and writes for the New York Review of Books. I mean, I had publishers at the time reach out to me, and they were interested in a certain kind of book, and it was a book that I feel I had tried to write, and and that many people will write and have written, and it, but it wasn't something that I could do. And this felt much more personal to me, and it was simply something that I felt I had to write, and I had to write it in the way that I wrote it, which is really against everything that would have been wanted from me. But it was the only way I felt to make something that was true, and that for me had a certain integrity and that I could live with. And I was surprised in the end when I actually managed to get it published. So no, I didn't really write with an audience in mind, but I did, as I was writing. And speaking of silence, I was conscious at points when I would write something and then I'd step back and think, what are my parents going to think? It was very, in a way, the writing of the book and then it actually coming out was this claiming of something. It was a claiming of a voice, and I feel because of this silence, we sort of remain quite infantilized, even into our 40s and 50s and 60s. And somehow this was like a claiming of an adulthood,
Oh, great.
I think the audience I was most concerned with was my family. But that went okay. They read it this summer and it was fine. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sausan. I got a feel that you're trying to make a semblance between the Egyptian mother and the Egyptian state, because I find them very similar. They're both very oppressive, and I don't. The Egyptian mother is very oppressive, and I don't know if that was your case, but like, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk about your mother, but like,
I was terrified what my mother was saying.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. So I don't know if you've drawn any such comparison in the book, and if yes or no, if you have any comments to that, like the personality of the Egyptian mother and how it relates to the Egyptian state thing.
I mean, it's, you know, like, I think all fiction all fiction draws on life. And this character, I borrowed from my life. I borrowed from the lives around me. But this, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's this girl grows up in a house with her mother. Her father has left. You don't find out why until much later. She's an only child, and it's a really silent house, and you feel the heaviness of whatever it is that happened to the father, the mother dealing with it without really dealing with it. Nothing is spoken about. And I grew up in a very, very different, I have a brother. There were always people in and out of where we lived. It was a much livelier space. But somewhere in that space, there was the silence and the sense of oppression based on what you could and couldn't do. And it's, you know, I think it's both, it starts in a very personal sense in the home, and it's also then extends in a political sense in terms of the state. And that was what I wanted or hoped to do with, like, I think when the character came to me, the structure came to me, but really what came to me was the atmosphere that I wanted to create, which was this completely suffocating, you know. A friend of mine said, Yasmine, you have to be careful. You know, there's a fine line between creating that sort of tedious, oppressive, slightly suffocating atmosphere and it working, and then you're just suffocating your reader. And some readers have said, this is like terrible. So yeah, I mean, I can absolutely relate. And that's why I was so scared that when my mother would read it, that she's like not entirely this person, but she'd think that she was.
My question has already been asked, so I should sit down. I was going to ask you why you wrote on this subject as fiction, and you've answered that, I believe. If you have any more to say on it, fine. And let me slip in another just quick question: will other members of your family feel what you are calling silence?
Sorry. Can you repeat the last part?
Oh. You wonderfully described something you call silence.
Yeah. Oh, with the other members of my family.
Right, like your uncle.
Yeah.
And you mentioned siblings.
Yeah. To add to the first part of your question, you know, even if I hadn't run up against certain things like these failings of memory, and my being very concerned about people in my life, I think that some things that we want to explore, I think and especially in a culture like mine, I feel that you can only kind of explore them in sort of a gray area where definite fact ends and a possible fiction or multiple truths begins, which is every time I tried to write, I found myself wanting to step into that space. I didn't feel I had the answers in the facts around me, or if I did, I didn't know how to put them together in that way. And like the uncle in the book he's based on many, many, many people who I feel he does not, you know, like my life didn't serve the story I wanted to tell. My life as it is or as it was. and it was like, I mean, not that this person has a very interesting life, but my life seemed more boring. The silence, it's so, the silence that, what I describe as silence, I don't know if, for example, my brother or my parents would use the same word, but I took back, I took copies of the book. The publisher gave me a few copies before it came out, and I was in New York on a fellowship, and I took them back. I sent a copy to my brother, and I had a copy each from my mother and my father. And as they read, I was very worried. And then I got an email from my mother, who lives above me. But she decided to send me this email because in the family we don't talk about anything. And she it was, "Dear Yasmine, thank you for this beautiful, I don't know what. I never spoke about X and Y and Z because I was trying to protect you." And my brother, and it went on sort of in this spirit. My brother also sent me an email, and that's how we communicate. And my brother said, "Dear Yasmine, it's really wonderful how," and he calls my mother Mommy and Daddy. "It's really wonderful how Daddy read the book and is enjoying it and feels X and Y and Z, and Mommy said X and Y and Z, and how we're all talking about it." And for me, it was, I feel that it was in putting certain things down on paper, it was almost giving permission to begin a conversation about things from our lives. And so even if they wouldn't use that word silence, I feel somehow that silence was a little bit broken. And I still haven't responded to my mother's email because I feel that's like it's a letter that's to be written.
Hi, Yasmine. I just want to congratulate you. This is, and just to plug this book, I picked this up from here. This is my local bookstore, and I picked it up a month ago, and I went home and read it in one sitting. My wife kept telling me, "Turn off the light," and and it's not because it's light reading. I wouldn't say it's because it's not plot driven, but it's really, like you're saying, it's character and atmospheric driven, and that atmosphere is kind of claustrophobic, but it didn't. I found it really gripping, and maybe it's because I'm already sort of taken with Cairo and these relationships. What struck me is how, and I guess I have two questions to ask. One is how different this is, how original this work is, especially coming out of Egypt. When I think of Egyptian writers trying to make sense of the here and now, either lots and lots of memoirs of, some of which are great and some are not so great, and a bunch of novels, most of which I think are most of the really interesting ones are speculative, sci-fi, dystopic kind of writing, and you're writing in a completely other mode. And I was just wondering how you think of yourself as a contemporary Egyptian writer. You're doing it in English, but you have a whole cohort next to you doing it in Arabic in a very different way. And sort of related to that is, you spoke really wonderfully about how this is a small story, and I was just wondering if you could talk more about that. Like when the revolution or the uprising or the failed revolution or whatever we want to call it was reported, it was usually at bird's eye view, Maidan Tahrir, and this sort of mosaic of individuals, and you're bringing us down. You're not even in the Maidan, right? But you're in this household with these human scale relationships, and it seems to me totally fascinating to think of that. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Elliot has a book coming out soon that you should all read. Thank you so much. Those are very difficult questions. about the form and the writing. You know, I went to an English school, and so writing in English, I think, seemed like the natural first choice when I was a teenager and starting to write. And like I wanted to write a book before I had any ideas. But obviously I was, you know, I grew up in Cairo and we spoke Arabic, and even though at school I was reading books in English and American literature, I also was reading the Arabic literature, and I feel somewhere, and so I write in English. A friend of mine who's a critic, well, two people said two things that maybe partly answer this. One of them said, this is a book of and from Egypt, but it's not an Egyptian novel. And another said, you're writing in English, but this is neither an English novel nor an American novel. And I feel that somewhere in that space of being a bit lost, you know, this sort of took shape and form. But I was, you know, that I had influences, like, you know, like Sanaa Ibrahim and what he did post 67 with language was something that I had thought about a lot. Like recently I've been reading a lot of Latin American literature and translation, which, you know, they really push against these ideas of form and structure, and which to me, I feel are much truer to life and to the lives that we live. And I think that was at the core of what I wanted to do, was to write something that was true. And I don't feel that depicting reality is necessarily always the truest truth. And that's what, you know, that was, I think in writing I wanted to strip away this idea even of story and narrative arc, and just try to get at the everyday, and which I think for many of us can be at times quite sort of tedious and uneventful, and quite solitary also. I don't know if I'm answering your question at all.
Yeah.
But in terms of how I think of myself, I don't think I don't feel that, you know, I don't, there are great writers in Egypt and who I admire and I respect, and there are great writers here and elsewhere, and I feel in ways you know, at times it's even a sentence or the structure of a paragraph that even if not consciously, if it strikes you somehow, you absorb it. And so I feel like, you know, I feel I've been influenced by a lot of literature and translation especially.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Kausar. I'm Egyptian American, and like Kareem, I've noticed a very big difference in when I go back to Egypt, what I see and what since 2011 compared to what I saw before. And what I saw before was sort of everybody that I came into contact with was sort of generally passively united against the government, and they would make fun of the government and the inefficiencies and inconsistencies, but not really working, not part of the working class and not working very hard to change things. And what I've seen since going back is an immense polarization that's happened. And it's, you know, we're very polarized in the United States, but we this has happened over a long period of time, and we sort of structure our lives so that we're surrounded by people who think the same way that we do, and there are red states and blue states, and we generally navigate ourselves to like-minded people. But what I see in Egypt is that polarization has happened within families, between families, and groups that used to be more unified. And I wonder if you see the same thing, and if that's something that you've how you've seen that changed over the last 5 years.
I lost friends for one piece I wrote for the New York Review of Books where I thought that I was trying to be objective and show two sides of a story, but people saw that I was either taking one side or taking the other side. And I mean, literally people stopped talking to me. And I feel I've been witness also to sort of vehement, almost arguments and discussions within families and between friends. Somewhere in the space of 2013 and around everything that happened, there was this, it was like society was just cut in two. And now I feel we're maybe moving towards a slightly more middle ground, slightly, but also I think people are choosing not to talk about politics in the way that they, had been for several years. My brother was living in England before the revolution and working there, and he came back. He missed the first half of 2011 and came back that summer. And I'll never forget us sitting around a table in my mother's apartment and with a bunch of his friends, and they're all architects and historians and sort of very deeply involved in heritage and conservation. And they were all talking politics, and my brother was sitting, who's usually the center of any gathering, just sitting in complete silence. And later he said, I don't know, it's so strange to me how everyone around me, like all my friends, I feel I can't talk to them anymore because this is all they want to talk about. And he hadn't lived the uprising. And now it's the complete opposite. And if you try to start a conversation around politics with those same people, nobody wants to talk about it. And it's partly because of that, like I think there's no stamina anymore. And what's happening in the United States is really scary.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
It's so worrying. I
just wanted, although you're writing in English, for a non-Egyptian audience primarily, are you feeling any constraints living there when you're writing about current events, current developments in Egypt?
I hadn't been feeling any, and I was, again, just speaking about this, is that I write mostly for the New York Review of Books, which nobody in Egypt reads.
Okay.
So
I read it.
So in Cairo, nobody pays any attention to me, which is fine. But it's true, it's really sad. But I have been trying to write a piece for a year and a half now, and I've been struggling because I feel that it's twofold. On the one hand, it comes from the experience I had with the last piece I wrote a few years ago that was kind of explosive, and people stopped talking to me, and I got horrible like emails and letters that didn't constructively attack or criticize the piece, but they became these very, very personalized attacks on who I am as a person, and morally my standing and ethically, and that's made me pause. But also I'm in a space now where I feel very, very critical of what's happening in the country and with the government. And I also feel many of us have had encounters with state security over the past few years, and I hadn't properly until last year, and it was completely arbitrary. It wasn't based on anyone knowing who I am. It was just this arbitrary, some police people deciding that I looked like someone who needed to be shaken up, and it petrified me. And it makes me pause more and more.
Is the regime doing anything at all to address the circumstances that led to the uprising, in your opinion, in your observation?
You know, in my observation, I think they're doing more than they're given credit for. They've introduced a subsidy, but they're doing more than they're given credit for in a way that's not sustainable. So they've introduced these certain subsidy programs, like I guess the equivalent of food stamps here. And you hear people talk about that. You know, you see around the city in a way that you never did before these government trucks with like produce and oil and rice being sold at subsidized prices, very, very reduced prices. And widespread. In the past, you could go to a few places, but now you sort of see them everywhere. Pensions have increased significantly. So they've done some things, but they're not, it's almost like Band-Aid measures because they're not sustainable. You know, the army has all these projects that are creating jobs, but I don't, you know, the truth is I don't feel I'm qualified to properly answer how do you even deal with a population of 91 million when, you know, like where do you begin? And how do you assess in terms of actually just quality of life? How do you assess if a government is doing the right thing and if it's doing enough or not enough? I mean, on many levels, this government is not doing enough, you know, and are focusing on things that they shouldn't be focusing on, like cracking down on culture and expression. And it's the last of our concerns. Like, why are we even taking time and resources on these things? But I also feel that it's sort of like when, and I know nothing about American politics, but it was sort of like when Obama came into office and, you know, like there was this idea with the Nobel Peace Prize and that, you know, there were these expectations and these hopes, and I feel that it's, in ways, everyone will fail. Anyone who comes into that position, if you expect them to bring about change overnight, your assessment of them is going to be that they failed. The problems that we have in Egypt are the result of decades and decades of mismanagement. You know, where do you begin?
You should call your mother and tell her what a great job.
Thank you. Thank you so much.